Can we really? If we look at, and one thing I did in the talk is I listed the 7 deadly sins, and I looked at the fact that I think that our culture is based today in Western capitalist modernity on basically inflaming them all for profit.
When Christ talks of Antichrist, this is what he's talking about.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is hands down the best discussion online about the battle between Christianity and culture that I have found. If you've ever felt uneasy about how the two seem to blur together in our modern context, you need to hear this. Check this out.
I can see at the moment around us in Western society a movement coalescing of what we might call civilizational Christians. And what this is, it's a movement of people who I think quite correctly can see that Western culture is fragmenting and is spiritually empty. And, all of the things that you talk about on your channel, all the things I write about, probably a lot of your readers would agree with, even if we might have different understandings of what's going on. And people look at this and they say, what's wrong with the culture? Why are things falling apart? Why do they not hold together? Why do things seem to be collapsing? And they come to the conclusion, which I think is correct, I agree with it, that there's a spiritual void at the heart of the culture. I think a culture is fundamentally a spiritual creation. It's taken me about 50 years to realize that, but I think that that's how it works. So if we agree that there's such a thing as Western culture, then we have to ask ourselves, what is it? And realistically, it's what used to be Christendom, which is the domain of the Western church, the Roman church. And so people then, from that conclusion, they leap to, from that observation, they leap to a conclusion, which is that if this used to be a Christian culture, then we need to revive Christianity to defend or promote or rejuvenate the culture. But they start in the wrong place. They start with the assumption that Christianity is some sort of tool, some sort of social or cultural tool, which we can use to defend the culture, fight the woke people, fight the Muslims, fight the Russians, the Chinese, whoever we want to fight, and get our culture back to some form that it used to be in or should be in the future. And I think it's dangerous because it's precisely the wrong way around. I think the Western culture is certainly a manifestation of Christianity. It absolutely was at the core of the culture. That's not the only thing that it comes from, but it's the spiritual core and has been for centuries. But not because people set out to build a civilization with Christianity, but because they tried to follow Christ. And around them grew a culture which then became a civilization, for better or for worse. And we can argue about whether it was good or bad. And I think that exactly the wrong thing is going on here. People are starting in the wrong place. They're saying, I want a certain type of civilization, so we should use the cross as a sword to build it. And the second thing I went on to say was, if we actually step back and look at the values of modern civilization, or indeed all civilization, if we want to be really controversial, can we actually say that they're Christian at all? Can we, really? If we look at, and one thing I did in the talk is I listed the 7 deadly sins, and I looked at the fact that I think that our culture is based today in Western capitalist modernity on basically inflaming them all for profit. And I think there's a good case to be made. I don't think if Christ came and looked at our culture today, he'd say, oh, well, this is exactly what I had in mind. Right? He would not. And could we really, in fact, say that any giant centralized culture based on accumulation and wealth creation and forced labor and all the rest of it is Christian at all? Regardless of what you think about that, the fundamental thing I was trying to say was that we have to, I think, head off at the pass this attempt to use the Christian way as a tool to defend or promote a certain type of culture, because I think that it's exceptionally dangerous and it's going to do damage to Christianity and probably to the culture as well.
So I believe and think that this analysis is spot on, and I want to take example A, our newly elected president. Now, this isn't about launching a personal attack on Trump, but rather critiquing the cultural landscape that enables a figure like him to lay hold to the claim of being a Christian and believing in Christianity without demonstrating the spiritual fruit or heritage that should accompany such an identity.
Having fun when I said, I drink the wine, I eat the cracker.
For example, take the Trump Bible as another example, a striking example and a striking phenomenon. Why does something like the Trump Bible exist in our culture? Because many conservative Christians see him as a champion of their vision for the nation, someone who will wield Christianity as a tool, as we're seeing in this clip, to reinforce their preferred social and political order. But here's the deeper issue at play. Rather than addressing the root problem, what Christianity says is the root problem, sin, Christianity is being co-opted to provide a veneer of moral legitimacy to cultural and political agendas. So, as Mr. Kingsforth rightly observes, our capitalist society thrives on the very vices that Scripture warns us against, using them to drive profits and sustain power structures. This isn't the kind of culture that I think Christ would want his name attached to, and it certainly isn't promoting the gospel, which announces his kingdom. All right, now let's listen to the response from Jonathan Pajot. Teaser, he has a very apocalyptic take.
No, I think that definitely your critique falls in the right time, and in the moment when we are seeing this shift that's happening, there are more and more people that are either moving explicitly towards Christianity or at least are not hostile to it in the ways that they were before, and some of these characters are not Christian themselves, and so. It's fascinating because when I watched the talk, I thought I really agree with you for 50%. I think that's what I wrote in the email. I think like 50% of what you said, I completely agree with you in the sense that, and I reread your text again, and I realized I actually agree with you more than 50%. 50% was more like the critique of what you said. I definitely agree with you. Maybe I could even say that I have the sense in which when Christ talks of Antichrist, this is what he's talking about, is in some ways something which is within Christianity, which is out of Christianity, but is using Christ for means that are different than for the glory of God or for the transformation of souls, And so you have the story of Simon the magician, for example, right there in Acts, which is in some ways an example of that, which is Simon the magician wants Christ so he can, make miracles and impress everyone. And that is exactly the opposite. And it's not that the apostles don't make miracles. It's that their miracles are rooted in a true faith and a true willingness to sacrifice for the highest thing. And so I think that I see that even if you look at the images in Revelation, you have like these two images of civilization. You have one which is the beast and the whore. And I think that's exactly what you're describing, both in terms of this tendency to move explicitly towards our passions in any way. The way the beast is described is very much in the way you describe in your own text the criticism of civilization, saying it's greed, it's exchange, it's lust, it's all these things that are kind of wrapped into one, and everybody is celebrating this whore because it's giving them what they want. And then at the same time, the machine, which is hiding under the whore, which is basically these crazy systems of control that set themselves up in the moment when we are basically giving ourselves to our passions, and to facilitate that as well. And so I see that. And then I also see this other image, which is the image of the heavenly Jerusalem. And maybe that's why I said 50-50, is because I see these two images as two possibilities of what is downstream from Christ. But no matter what, I agree that to have the heavenly Jerusalem, it's not, you don't try to get the heavenly Jerusalem. You try to see the Son of Man. You try to live in the light, that the Lamb provides. And then downstream from that, you do have some image of civilization. And that's maybe the question I have for you, is that, because you're right, you do push pretty radically in your talk. It's like you say all civilization is wrong. And I'm thinking, it seems though that there's like the wheat and the chaff in civilization, kind of like what Christ describes, and that, for example, our civilization, for all its evil, and I totally agree with that, is probably the civilization in which the fewest people die of hunger that has ever existed in the history of humanity, right? We have another type of despair, which is more kind of spiritual despair, but that's a real thing. It's a real thing that we have this virtue of taking care of the poor. That's part of the system. Anyways, I'm talked a lot, but so maybe I set you up with these two opposites, and I want to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, I mean, I have a long history of complaining about civilization. That's the first thing. So I don't want to try and I've made a career out of it, and I don't want to be suggesting that luckily Jesus agrees with me, because that wasn't the point. I mean, one of the things I did want to do in the talk with seriousness, and one of the reasons I wanted to give it, I didn't want to just stand up there and attack people. I'm actually looking at myself quite a lot of the time. Because if we look at the way Christ tells us to live in the Gospels, it's not the way I'm living, right? That's the reality of it. And the more Christian I become, the more Christ is sort of inside me bashing away and churning things around, the more that becomes painfully apparent. And so that's the paradox we're all living in as Christians. If I look at the things we're told to do in terms of wealth and power and resisting evil or not resisting evil, it's not only the opposite of what our civilization tells us to do, it's pretty much the opposite of what I do a lot of the time. So, and I did try and say that a couple of times. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm sort of preaching as a holy man, because I'm really not. I mean, it's a challenge, right? So we are living in a top-down machine civilization, whatever you want to call it. There we are. It's not going away. It's existed for 10,000 years. Now, of course, it gives us good material things. There's no doubt about that. That's why we like it, and people do like it. The question is what the costs are, and that's always the question. What's downstream of all the good stuff we get? What's literally downstream, sometimes in the rivers and in the destruction of the forests and the loss of the culture and all the things that we can see happening, right? So you never get anything for free. You do get your good stuff, but you get a lot of bad stuff as well. And that's just life. So there's not a lot to be gained just from saying civilization is bad and we should not live in it, because we do. There's no getting away from it. That's where we are. The question is what kind of values as Christians we're actually supposed to be pursuing. That's my question. And as I say, it's a personal question for me and for us and for the culture we live in. I can't escape the fact the more I read of the church fathers, the more I read of the monastic saints, the more I read of the Philokalia, the more I read of the Gospels, and it's very, very difficult you have to try very hard to escape the fact that there is a clear division between what Christ calls the world and what he calls the kingdom. And there's no doubt about it. And he says very clearly, I've called you out of the world, and because I've called you out of the world, you're going to be hated by the values of the world. The world being the passions that build the kind of things that you're just talking about. Babylon as the kind of manifestation of the great corrupt global city. And interestingly, in the book of Revelation, when Babylon is at its most corrupted, you hear this voice from the heaven, don't you? You hear Christ, and he says, come out of her, my people. It's a really interesting thought. What are you supposed to do with Babylon? You're supposed to leave, because Babylon is corrupt and the heavenly Jerusalem is coming instead. So we've got this tension all the time, and the whole of Christianity seems to me like a tension. I wrote about it recently as feeling like a kind of Zen koan that you're walking around all the time, just going, what is this? It's not a logical system here. So, of course, there are all these contradictions and tensions in it. But the question becomes, what does a Christian life look like? And therefore, what does a Christian culture look like? And therefore, how should we live that? And there might be a lot of answers to that. And you can only really try and do it by living it, as many people have done for 2,000 years.
So to conclude, there is the world and there is the kingdom, and they are fundamentally distinct. The world is shaped by consumeristic capitalism, driven by the pursuits of hedonistic excess, while the kingdom is a lived embodiment of Christ's commands, marked by self-giving love and radical discipleship. In short, you cannot straddle both realities, and I think that's one of the key takeaways. The world and the kingdom are inherently incompatible with one another. What this discussion makes clear is that you cannot selectively appropriate aspects of the kingdom in an attempt to reform the world. I think that's kind of what conservative Christianity is trying to do with Trump. There is no seamless fusion of the two. Instead, we are called to inhabit the paradoxical tension of grace and human frailty. I love that kind of paradoxical move that Mr. Kingsforth made. We need to continue to grow in the likeness of Christ, even amidst this paradox. This cannot be manipulated or replicated through external systems. That's so crucial. The kingdom is not an ideological framework to reconstruct a so-called better world on human terms. It is the very thing that overturns the world itself. Let me restate that. The kingdom of God is the very thing that overturns the world itself. Christianity is not a tool for societal engineering. It's not a tool to just make a better version of the world that we would want. No, it's a radical inbreaking of God's reign that reshapes everything. And the reality is, most of the time, and if we are of the world, we won't like that. And I think that's so crucial. There's something distinct and different about the kingdom of God, and trying to morph Christianity and culture together will never work. Because why? Christianity is Christ, and without him, there is no Christianity. All right, that's all I have for this video. See you in the next one. Peace.